In our last couple of videos, we have seen how the Taichi diesel fuel storage tank and the American model sanding tower were assembled and painted, but not fully completed. In this video, we will see them move a little closer to completion, plus we will see how the American model's fuel stands are assembled and painted. The biggest change to the diesel shop area is the shop building itself. In this video, we will discuss how the old building layout was changed from what looked like two separate buildings into one with a slightly smaller footprint. Along the way, we will see how the painting, decaling, and final assembly was done, plus modifications to the concrete fuel pads to fit the new footprint. Here we see the two main components of the original building complex after it had been shortened by 4 or 5 inches. You can see here where I've placed some wall components to mock up roughly where the new wall section would go, but I still haven't as yet raised the profile of the old section to match the main building. The intention here, or goal of this project, was to make both halves of the building look like it's all one building essentially, so raising the front section of the building using the same roof components, give it the same roof line. And here we're using the track spacing or door spacing from the original engine house kit to mark up where the doors would land on the car shop kit. The track spacings on the two kits are not the same, but since I didn't want to rebuild, rip out and relay the tracks that go into the shop, I had to mark off where to cut the wall sections from the car shops to match. In the original building layout, the left portion of the building, or the narrower portion of the building, wasn't the same height as the right side, the larger section, because it didn't have the concrete foundation beneath it. In order for the modified or new single building to have the same roof line, the concrete foundation was added to the section that didn't have it before. The truck loading doors that are provided in the Pike Stuff kits are really low profile. They're not really tall enough for proper tractor trailer loading. So I wanted to keep the door location, but I wanted a larger roll-up door. So I fished around for some extra leftover parts from various Walters kits and came up with this arrangement. Here we see all the walls and foundation pieces laid out. There's only one cut left to make, and that's along the line that the pencil is pointing to. That will allow us to bring forward a small section of the truck loading dock wall to meet up with the front corner of the locomotive roll-up doors. I had used the Pike Stuff car shop kits, several of them in fact, as source materials for a bunch of other industries on the layout, so I had lots and lots of leftover parts to use in this project. These splice bars and downspouts were particularly useful. Here you see one of those splice bars being used to connect two long wall sections together. They're also used to extend the height of the corrugated wall sections. This was necessary because the kits as designed are intended for the walls to only be on the outside perimeter of the building. For this new building design, however, we moved the wall away from the outside limit towards the center or peak of the roof, and so the wall had to be a little bit taller. One of the unexpected complications of this project was that the corrugations on the walls are not exactly the same on the car shop kit and the diesel shop kit, so you have to be very careful to make sure you're using like for like. I didn't have a lot of extra pieces of the walls, so I had to cut strips from the same piece to make it fit. Once the individual pieces were glued in place, they were trimmed so they were all the same height. I wasn't too concerned about the obvious seam that it creates because I knew I was going to be painting it a darker color. Here we see the two halves of the diesel shop entrance being glued together. And then a quick height check to make sure all the parts line up. The next step was to create a common roof line for the entire building. So I connected all the walls together with masking tape so I can measure the exact missing piece of roof required. The long side was easy. It was just about 2.5 sections of standard roof sheets, but the short side was a little more difficult. I had the same problem that I had with the wall sections. The roof pattern is not exactly the same on the car shop kit as on the locomotive shop kit, so I had to cut it very carefully and match it up as best I could. Once it's painted, it won't really be noticeable, especially since there'll be a separate ridge along the peak of the roof. The roof ridges are on the same sprue as the downspouts. I counted about 9 or 10 downspouts to collect all the rainwater from the roof. After I removed all the downspouts and roof ridges from the sprue, I noticed something interesting. The sprues themselves have about the right dimensions and shape to be used as parking lot curbs. Free bonus parts! Almost forgot, I also needed some roll-up doors for the diesel shop entrance. Only needed one, of course, because I'm going to just cut 2 small strips to model them in the open position. My laziness got the better of me, and I chose to use spray can paints to paint the entire building. Almost a fatal mistake. You'll see why. The completed building would have been way too awkward and wobbly, actually, without the roof in place to paint and decal. So all of the individual walls were done separately before assembly. Most of the wall sections used in this kit rebuild had already been painted once before and painted using spray can paint. So this second coat of paint put at risk some of the details in the corrugated metal, especially the yellow and the red paint. It also came with one hell of a shiny coat. Luckily, I was able to tone it down quite a bit with a good coat of flat afterwards. Pike Stuff kits come with door and window locations marked on the insides of their walls. But if you're not using those windows and doors, they kind of look awkward, especially if you can see inside the building when the model is finished. I laminated a very thin sheet of styrene, painted steel gray to the inside of the wall and nicely covered up those window and door cutouts. The Pike Stuff wall sections come with all their corners pre-beveled at 45 degrees, so you get a nice 90-degree joint when you assemble their kits. However, if you're doing any kind of kit bashing, like I'm doing here, the wall sections don't necessarily line up perfectly. The building is also much larger than a typical build if you're just following the instructions in the kits. As a result, the building is quite wobbly before you get the roof on it. So I created a bunch of strengthening L girders for each inside and outside corner of the building. The door opening you see here is where the truck door goes. You have to scrape away the paint from the frame before gluing it. And here's a view of all of our downspouts just after painting. Most of them had to be lengthened either for the increased wall height or to account for the concrete footing. After all the major wall and foundation parts were connected together, the roof was placed on top, but I had to use quite a lot of weight to hold it down because there's only a very small lip around the edge of the walls to connect to the roof. In hindsight, I probably should have tried to create some kind of L-girder like I did for the corners. And here's a look at the first test fitting back on the layout, and then follow that up with adding the downspouts and roof vents. And here is a video tour of the completed building from all sides. One last note on the building before we move on. The stripes that you see on the building, it's no coincidence that they line up with the top stripe on the locomotives. My original intent was to have two stripes so that both would line up with the stripes on the locomotive, but I felt that would kind of be too much. Sometimes a simpler approach is better, and so I left it with just the one stripe. And speaking of stripes and decals in general, learned a hard lesson on this project. Even high quality custom made decals don't last forever. The package of Q&NE decals that I had made for me by Highball Graphics in 2012 are now 11 years old, and they just aren't as flexible as they used to be, even with repeated coatings of microset and microsaw. So just another reason why I didn't carry on with the second stripe. Because the original shop building was shortened by about 4 or 5 inches, we exposed a section of track that was inside the building that was not covered in or filled in with concrete. I can't remember why only one of the tracks is exposed like that, but in any case, filling it in was done just like every other road crossing that I had done on the layout, using patching plaster, sanding it down with fine sandpaper, scraping it to the railhead, and then cutting out the flangeways using a dental pick, followed up with a nail file to widen the flangeways just a bit. I took the opportunity to touch up a few of the other areas around the shop building that needed it, followed up with a fresh coat of concrete, and did some light weathering using some washes primarily made of black to simulate the oil drippings, etc. The storage tank is pretty much the same as it was in the last video that you saw, but some thought has been given to how to place it within the shop area, and also as to how we protect the area with some form of berm. I did a test fit with the berm that comes with the ethanol kit, but it's just too big, way too big, doesn't fit. And then I figured let's try a concrete wall, and used Lego to simulate what that might look like. I assembled one of the staircases that comes with the ethanol berm kit and test fit it over the Lego, and it actually fits perfectly. So we're going to do something like that. Haven't figured out yet what to use for the wall itself, but the size and height is pretty much what you see here. When we last saw the sanding tower, we had just test fit one of the hoses. Here we see that all 4 hoses are connected, but it wasn't easy. The kit comes with tiny little plastic pins molded onto the arms that you slide the empty wire onto. That little pin is very easy to break off, and that's what happened to me. So I had to resort to drilling out with a very, very fine tip drill a hole so I could insert a piece of wire to act as a new pin. I used a piece of 025 piano wire or music wire. It was a good friction fit inside the 20 gauge wire casing, cut it to size, and then glued it to the arm using CA. The next step was to connect the counterweights between the tower and the arms, but before doing that I painted them black, so it'd be easier to paint them before stringing them up than after. I also took the opportunity at this time to paint the safety cage and safety railings at the top of the tower bright yellow. Connecting the arms to the tower is simply a matter of threading the thread that's supplied with the kit and adding a drop of CA both to the top of the counterweight and to the connection at the arm. I also tied knots in the string around the loops both on the weight and the arm, but before I did that I measured the placement of the counterbalance based on the highest and lowest levels of the arms. If you do it right, these arms will be fully functional and can be placed and held in any position because the counterbalances act against the friction on the pulley. You'll notice that the inside hoses are bent in an S shape of sorts. This is per the prototype so that the locomotives can pass underneath them. In the real world, there's another set of pulleys that actually hold those hoses off to the side. Those are not included in the kit. You have to use your imagination. And here's a view of the first test fitting of the sand tower in the diesel shop area. The last piece of the diesel shop puzzle are the fuel stands. They come 2 to a package from American Limited, same manufacturer as the sand tower. Instructions are provided on the back of the package, one simple exploded diagram, and all the parts are on 2 sprues. Some of the parts are tiny, so I would recommend using magnifying glasses and a very sharp hobby knife. The base assembly is fairly straightforward. The fun part is the stands themselves, which, if you do it right, like the sand tower kit, are fully positionable. The 2 halves of the arm basically fit into one another like a shoulder socket, and there's a tiny hole on one part where a pin needs to be inserted to hold them in place. Unfortunately, those tiny holes are just starter holes, and you have to drill them out with a tiny drill bit. Once that's done, the 20 gauge wire that's supplied with the kit can be inserted into the drilled out hole to connect the 2 arms together. The trick to keeping them positionable will be to make sure that no paint gets in between the 2 halves of the arms while it dries. The T-frame gets inserted into the base and connects to the arms and allows the arms to rotate a full 360 degrees, again provided that no paint is allowed to get into the base where it connects. Same caution for where the T-bar connects with the arms themselves. Got to keep the paint out of there so the arms can swivel up and down freely. Here's a look at all the moving parts connected together before painting. The counterbalances are then added to the T-frames, and the nozzles are added to short sections of the 20 gauge wire casings stripped from the wire itself. Following the instructions in the kit, as well as photos of the prototype fuel stands, the T section and hinge are painted orange. The base and flexible hose sections are left unpainted in black, and the arms are painted silver, as are the nozzles. And here's a close-up first look at the completed fuel stands. Plus, I'll look at the first test fitting on the layout itself. And here's a final overview of how all the parts fit together. Probably need to have some thought put into the final placement, whether they're too close together or whether both stands are in fact required. But that's a topic for another video. I hope you've enjoyed coming along for the ride on this project. We'll see you next time.